Got it. All right. Mr. Bernstein, you want to take us away?
Righto, it's already June 24th, and this is the June 24th Tinderbox Meetup with Michael Becker. I'm Mark Bernstein, the developer of Tinderbox, and today we have a special guest, Kathryn Cramer, who was one of the very first users of Tinderbox, also a pioneer in using story space for literary hypertext. She's also a noted anthologist and author of science fiction and horror, and taught me everything I know about editing, which has never been quite enough. She recently picked up a Master's of Design in Strategic Foresight at OCAD. Is that how you pronounce it these days?
OCAD, yes.
Yes.
Which stands for Ontario College of Art and Design, except they became a university. So
right,
now
so it's not a
OCAD
college
University.
anymore.
Yeah.
Right, it's the college that is not a college. And
Right.
then got another master's in AI at the University of Vermont, like just minutes ago.
It's actually not quite either of those. I'm one course. I've got a I just finished their certificate in complex systems and data science, and I'm one course which is offered next spring from the Master of Science. And I have specialized. I have this weird little niche interest, which is GPT-3, which the world has come to visit. So I started off doing this arcane thing over there, and now everybody wants to know about it.
Great.
Awesome.
So that's the introduction, and I'll hand it back to Michael Becker.
Okay, welcome. So for those that are not new to us, so typically we meet every week to discuss all things learning and knowledge management around the concepts of Tinderbox and the tools that fall within that family. Our typical format is to go around the room and introduce new people if they so want to be introduced to the community, and they could talk about the projects they're working on. Typically, if we don't have a theme, which we do today, we'll then dig into any projects that people are working on or questions that they may have about the tool. We'll then work and discuss new releases or elements that are happening within the overall community. And then we'll discuss our theme. Super excited to have our theme today, which is basically Kathryn. She's going to talk to us about her views of the world and what's going on. And we can jump right into that. But Kathryn, before we get started, let's go around the room. Does anybody have any burning topics, questions, issues that they're seeing blockers in any of their projects that we want to get started? Address, or do we want to go into Kathryn and we can address those at the end? What do we want to do?
They go to Kathryn.
All right. I like it. Community speaks. So Kathryn, you now have the floor. You've got the next 90 minutes to help guide a conversation with us through what's going on in the world.
So I noticed when Mark sent out the announcement, he talked about the way I was using Tinderbox for what was essentially a form of bloggish investigative journalism at the time. And that was actually about 20 years ago, but that thing is surprisingly relevant now. I had this weird little hobby of blogging about the goings on of private military contractors. Again, something that has become suddenly relevant, which is that I had a very active blog in about 2006, 2007 through about 2011. And I ended up somewhat incongruously focusing on military privatization. And that was a kind of weird subject because there was all kinds of little arcane threads and all kinds of people and events and locations and so on. So I used Tinderbox and I created a sort of template, which I called distilled essence, into which I could throw all of the things I found and then be able to find them again later. I could share my screen for a moment if you'd like, and I can show you that that thing, which I did dig up. Here it is. And later on we can, now can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. So, I had an index that, but I said specific templates for characters, primary characters, incidental characters, and also relationships between them, settings, companies, organizations, and then sources, narrative elements, like MacGuffins or something you don't usually find in databases, but in terms of trying to figure out the story, and then various kinds of prototypes. So that's what I think I gave a talk about that sometime a long time ago. I drove up to Boston. This whole military privatization thing has become somewhat relevant overnight with the sudden conflict in Russia, because this is kind of how that kind of situation can go. But I now am working on now I'm going to stop share and I'm going to talk for a bit and then I might share again. I've been working on, I started out interested in GPT-3 as a way of looking at scenarios. My master's project at OCAD was on scenario, sort of imagining scenario space, how many different ways things could go, because in my master's program, they were teaching us about, how to create foresight scenarios, because it was in strategic foresight and innovation. And the problem with foresight scenarios, as we were practicing, is they're not very robust. I mean, it seemed to me, and I had a long conversation with science fiction writer Carl Schrader, that every foresight scenario was like one news story away from obsolescence, and sort of like, what could we do about it? Could we come up with something that would be self-healing with regard to that? And so I envisioned how that might be automated. And then I read a New Yorker article in May of 2021 about pseudo-writes, that's spelled SUDORITE, which is a GPT-3 API for generating fiction. And so I got in touch with the proprietors of that. And this was just about the time I was leaving Canada. I had intended to be there for 16 months and we stayed an extra year because of the pandemic. So it was like, okay, now time to go home. So there was this sort of whole chaotic move back from Toronto. And then once I was back in the United States, had a Zoom call with them. And my first question was, can GPT-3 do this thing that I want to do in terms of sort of scenario creation, in terms of foresight scenarios? And his initial answer was a pretty immediate no. And then we had a really interesting conversation about what it could do. So I spent the summer of 2021 banging on GPT-3, trying to get it to do interesting things. And then I did, but I only had access to it through pseudo-write. And then in October or November, I got access and then spent a lot of time engaging with the extent to which character can be understood through GPT-3. And I did a book that was actually on submission to MIT Press for a while. They ultimately rejected it, partly because ChatGPT had come out and they felt it would be obsolete. But I had like interviews or it's just to say conversations or panel discussions with characters generated via GPT-3. So I had a pretty good feel for it. And then
so, Kathryn, can I introduce you real quick? So you're throwing in a lot of terms, and for me at least,
okay,
give some background on. So ChatGPT, which is based on GPT-3, didn't invent GPT-3, correct? So maybe you can give us some history too. So like, how is pseudo-write using GPT-3? How is ChatGPT using GPT-3? Like, where are all these pieces coming from?
Okay, first of all, when I was working on my master's thesis, I completely missed this whole thing because I was searching on the term computational narrative, and there was this whole a large language model narrative thing happening where they were building neural networks that could generate language. And the one that was out that I probably should have known about when I was working on my master's thesis, but didn't, is called GPT-2. And there's a really good essay on how GPTs work by Stephen Wolfram, which is posted as a blog post on his blog, where you can get access to Mathematica and you can play directly with GPT-2. So you can like give it a couple of keywords, and what it does is generate the words that come after it. So if you say George Soros, and it will tell you a conspiracy theory. It will, figure out what the words are supposed to come out after that. And if you give it Kim Kardashian, or at least when I did, it told me that she was had sexually assaulted her boyfriend or something like that. So you can build this thing and it gives you the most likely words that come after it. GPT-3 is was to me only accessible via an API called pseudo-write, which is to say, okay, OpenAI started as a sort of research nonprofit and then went for profit, but they've rolled out these things in a very, very constrained way over time. GPT stands for generative pre-trained transformer. And generative refers to what it's generating at the end, which is to say the language. And so they there's the process they go to is first they create a corpus, then they use that, which is to say all the language they're going to use in it, all the documents, which may be your own web pages for as far as I know. Then there's a set of tokens that are created, which are the nodes in this network. So they run an algorithm over those words. They find the most likely words. They break it down into little bits, and then they build it up into longer words. And that's the tokenizer process. Then what they do after that is they train their model, which is to say making the links between these nodes, the weights between the tokens. And then, finally you get the thing that you can talk to or use via API. API access was not something I had access to for a while. So after I was working through the pseudo-write web access, then...
So can I pause you there real quick though, just so I'm clear in my own head, and I apologize if others.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about a node, is a node like a word, or is a node a collection of words?
Well, that's an interesting question, because, there's a term called a holon, which is an entity that is both an individual part and a whole. And and I think this applies to this. This is not a technical term from what OpenAI is doing. This is a term that can be applied to this. But at the most basic unit is the token. So the word I, or the letter I, can be a token, and the letter T can be a token. Those can be combined, and then the letter it, or the word it, can be a token. But also the word university can be a token. So as far as it's making the links between them, it's of equal weight in terms of like it's of equal stature to it. And Hannity, as in Sean Hannity, who's a character, can also be a token. But from the point of view of the software making the connections and drawing the weights, there is no real fundamental difference between Hannity and the letter I.
Right.
And what happens next is part of the subject of my current research. So when we those of us who work with Tinderbox are used to links and nodes. Here's the node, and then you make links to it, and yeah, you can store stuff in it. You can't store stuff inside the nodes in this kind of thing. It's all about the connections between them. But there are sort of little nests of tokens that then somehow become larger and larger sets of links. But these are kind of not well described in terms of what happens in these black box AI systems. Somehow first names get linked with last names, and relationships between people and circumstances and stories take place.
So the somehow is automagically they happen.
Yes.
There's some fancy
yes.
math behind the scenes that makes that happen.
Yeah, it has to do with a lot of matrices, matrix multiplication and so on.
Okay.
So what I discovered and I say discovered because I mean, it's something I found out rather than like discovering a new, a new planet, was that personal names are in a lot of the tokenization systems. And I had been wondering for a while how information about specific people got encoded in these language models. As you can see, going way back to my Tinderbox thing, one of the first things I did when making my networks to understand things was to create nodes for characters and relationships between characters. Now it varies from one to another. Cybert, which is a neural network, a language model for understanding the sciences, has almost no characters in it because they've somehow cleaned that out. There are only, I think Stevenson is one of the proper names, and then Epstein and Barr are, but because Epstein-Barr is a virus. But other than that, that's completely clean of it. The one that I've found and like nobody reads tokenization maps apparently, but I have been doing that. The one that has the most personal names in it seems to be Clip that I found, which is the one that was used to train the Dolly text to image thing. And it changes from model to model. It's not just OpenAI. A lot of them have proper names in them. There's ones from Facebook. There's ones from the Alan AI. I think Alan AI one I found Thunberg as a token, and from 2019. Greta Thunberg was 16 at that point. So not only is it people, I mean, mostly famous people who get one kind or a token or another via this algorithmic process, but in this particular case, it was a minor. Now, what's really peculiar about the tokenization system for ChatGPT and GPT-4 is that a lot of the other celebrities are gone from it, but Trump world, which is to say the people associated with Donald Trump and Trump's antagonists, which is to say Adam Schiff, Charles Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and so on, a lot of them have tokens, and I've been trying to understand first of all, how did that happen? And what is the effect of that? I think it's significantly a symptom of having used Twitter data. OpenAI was apparently paying Twitter about $2 million a year to use Twitter data to train. And one of the things that's supposed to happen when you train these models is you're supposed to clean out a lot of the duplicate text. So there will be reproductions of web pages and so on in the Common Crawl, so there'll be duplications. But what appears to be the case is that what happens when you use Twitter data may be that all of the retweets function as duplication. And so the prevalence of Donald Trump's Twitter network caused this sort of token cruft, cultural driftwood on the beach of people that are in one way or another would be in a Tinderbox diagram of what Trump world looks like, were I to use that thing I was working on in 2007. So there's kind of this arc from, well, I'll use my Tinderbox made network, and then through a science fiction career and various other things, and through trying to figure out how to make scenarios robust, to now trying to understand, how the sausage is made and how it functions differently if there are personal names in it and if there are not. I found it really, really surprising that there are any personal names in there, because there are like all kinds of strict European privacy laws and so on. And I think they thought it was okay because a lot of these people are public figures, but that's kind of not the point in terms of how it might function differently. So having said a lot of things, I'm going to pause and let you folks talk for a bit, and you can ask me questions and I can tell you more, or I can show you pretty pictures.
So maybe I'll start with a question and others can raise their hand. So you've given us a lot of background. Maybe you could, bring us back to the beginning, or and what I mean by the beginning, like what is the overall objective? So yeah, and summarize that again so we can kind of keep anchor
Okay,
ourselves
so
back.
Yeah, you explained a lot of constructs.
Right.
In background, right?
So right now I'm a graduate student in complex systems and data science, and I am interested in how personality functions in the age of digital reproduction, which is a sort of a riff on Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Digital Reproduction. That, one of the things about our notions of privacy as they function in the world now is a lot of them are focused on like financial crime, your social security number, your mother's maiden name, and so on. But my social security number is not really central to my personality. It's a thing over there that can cause algorithms to release money to people on my behalf when I don't want them to. But what's happened with art, for example, is really interesting. It's much more invasive to have somebody be able to replicate your art in a way that like is recognizably your style and your subject matter. It's like much more personal. The other things that can be taken by models like this and replicated with enough data is, those quirks that are uniquely you, the way in which you smile that makes you unique. And so there's a whole transition that we are undergoing right now where our personalities and what is specific or private to us can be commodified without necessarily our knowledge or understanding or permission or compensation. One of the possible future scenarios here is that in a way we are all in the future Henrietta Lacks, that a thing that is found about that is really valuable to us can be taken and replicated and automated and harvested. And on the other hand, I really, really love working with language models. So I'm very pro language model, while at the same time being fascinated with the extent to which they interact with personality and people. My big project for this time last year was editing AI Seance's Portrait of a Language Model, which was the book of interviews and such. And I'm still trying to decide whether it's obsolescent because of ChatGPT or whether it's actually more relevant, because there's a lot of guardrails on this new technology preventing you from understanding what's in there. I mean, I'm sure all of us who spent time with ChatGPT have had Henrietta Lacks, Mark, can you look up the spelling of Henrietta Lacks?
So just the background on that. So Henrietta Lacks was a woman in the 50s, an African-American woman who basically had her cancer cells stolen by the medical industry. And those cells became the basis of all modern day cancer research. And it was about 10, 12 years ago that her family was actually remunerated because we realized that we stole her genetic property and used it for commercial purposes and never recognized her for it.
Yes. Okay.
But it took 50 something, 60 years to recognize that.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of us spend a lot of time developing a skill or a style or something. And some people's skills or styles can be appropriated more easily than others. And this is something that, a lot of artists are finding out right now. And writers to some extent, but it's actually much harder to get to write fiction than than it is for a language model to write fiction that's up to commercial standards than it is to generate something that looks like science fiction cover art. So a lot of people of my acquaintance are in a somewhat awkward position of being high enough profile that people want their art to look like them, but trying to decide whether they're going head to head with replicated versions of their own.
So can I ask you a question though? So and this might be totally an aside, but I've read stories on how they've said, like, for instance, the 1980s was the most prolific music generation because it was actually, if you analyze it, it had the most notes. You know, and if you go to today, we've commercialized music just to a certain subset of notes that are actually commercializable, meaning
Mhm.
that people are willing to buy and sell it. And so what are it feels like there's a lot of risks in what we're doing with these. And the reason why I'm riffing on that is you just use the word commercializable. And
Mhm.
so, and so like a lot of the music that was so popular in the 80s couldn't even be made today because no one would fund it. Or
Right.
it's going to be made it's going to have to somehow be self-funded. So what do we do in this world where the systems can actually be us, do it for free, and how do we survive, I guess is my question.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure the answer to how we survive that, but okay, here's my disaster scenario for commercial fiction. It's not a disaster. The real problem with what's happening now, which is that things that look plausibly enough like science fiction stories or general fiction can be generated and submitted to publishers. That's a big problem for publishers. It's not a big problem for small publishers that have to read the slush. It's not a big problem for the industry as a whole in terms of how fiction exists. The point at which the formula for what best sells is the breaking point. Which is that, I mean, another piece of my background that we didn't cover is that I was the wife of David Hartwell, who died about 7 years ago, who was a major science fiction editor at Tor Books. But one of the things I know from being David's wife is that publishers would relentlessly try, the corporate ownership would want them to only publish bestsellers. And the thing is, nobody really knows that formula. There's a lot of luck and volatility and so on. But if AI could crack the code for what people really wanted to read, then the publishers would no longer need the mid list. And the mid list is where the good stuff is really, where the life of literature is. And so if I give them 10 years to crack that, and then commercial fiction goes the way of poetry, where yes, there are writers, but they're much lower stature than, say, poetry in the 19th century. 19th century poetry used to have bestsellers. Poetry now is this arcane thing that's done by people who teach MFA programs, or by lots of people who are paid almost nothing, or maybe pay to get published. And I think fiction is going that way at the point where they crack the bestseller code. Now,
real quick, our resident poet just immediately raised his hand. So, Mr. Art.
Yeah, you got it. Hi, thanks so much for this. I'm super. There's so many questions I actually have to ask, and it would be the entire whole meetup invitation. But so I'll try to cut to the quick. So on the one point, I think what you're most recently trying to imply, trying to sort of showcase is the fact that AI is a tool to deploy to sort of commercialize and dumb down the public broadly by means of harvesting data sets that are already out there. So for example, I don't really like spending any time on Twitter, but I can't escape it because ultimately a beast that's been trained on Twitter speak is going to be influencing me in some way or the other in a brochure I read or the news I digest 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years from now. And that basically extends even to fiction or pretty much anything people might choose to consume.
I'd say it goes in 2 directions. I mean, on the one hand, my experiments with tokenizing a body of words that's not from AI versus ones that are from AI, and there is a sort of open source tokenizers, is that the end vocabulary of the tokenized AI text is much less interesting. So it's hard in any one conversation to see if there's a diminishment of vocabulary, but I think there is. But on the other hand, I also would argue that used right, tools like GPT-4 can actually make you think a lot better. They take a lot of the sort of drudgery out of things, the way, the pocket calculator took the drudgery out of mathematical calculation, and we no longer had to occupy ourselves with slide rules. There's a lot of like frameworks from foresight, innovation, and business where you can like send the thing through the process where it would have taken 4 people with a whiteboard and 4 post-it notes several hours to come up with the thing, and the results will be about the same. So in as much as these kind of frameworks that can be automated are cognitively useful, you can actually advance your thinking pretty fast on some topics. So I'm of two minds about it. I mean, yes, there are certainly dangers to our culture in general from this, but there's also ways in which people are able to think now and will be able to think that were not possible a few years ago.
Yeah, I think the comparison to calculators is actually just on point, and that sort of, yeah, I can definitely understand the perspective of, yeah, we're becoming intelligent in different ways, and the next generations are going to start at a point where our generations basically top out, so to speak. But in just different ways of grasping and dealing with abstract concepts and the like. Yeah, but then as long as there's a financial underpinning, I mean, that risk, or a political underpinning for that matter, there's always the risk that it cannot be unbiased. And then, as you were pointing out, like if you keep cloning something, it loses its spirit and dies. So
Right.
just how much rigor can you put into this process?
Well, and also before you answer that, the other question though is, the calculator, it would help me perform calculations, but I still have to think. Like, whereas like those recent lawyers that make it discarded because they actually submitted their brief, because they asked ChatGPT to do their homework for them. Like,
Yeah.
there's a gap between the calculator and this. And you, as you seem to know the comments or the case I'm referring to. So maybe you can.
Oh yeah,
Maybe you
yeah.
can tell people about that case and make that distinction between the calculator and this.
Yeah, well, one of the first things I learned about ChatGPT when I had access, once I had access to it via the playground environment, was that it would make stuff up, which is called machine hallucination. And that term in computer science has been used for about 20 years, 25 years, something like that. It initially pertained to hallucination being a technique to get machine vision to work better, where it would sort of use the patterns to imagine things sort of a little bit beyond what it really had the data to support. And one of the first things I found out once I was playing with GPT and GPT-3 was that if you gave it a piece of text that had quotations from somebody in it, it would continue that piece of text and it would add more quotations because that's what it was called for. And I was quoting a really obscure book on the history of the Champlain Valley, and I was pretty sure that it did not have, that it was making this up. And it was like, oh my God, it's making up quotations. So I found this out pretty quick. There are a lot of other complexities to how these things work, but at base, what they're trying to do is it's fancy autocomplete. It's like, what is the next word? Now, I'm really interested in all the cul-de-sacs other than how that works, but they're essentially finding out the same thing I found out when I gave it something with a quotation in it, that if it's something that's supposed to cite legal cases, if it's, it will go and cite more legal cases, whether it has access to legal cases or not. And apparently the lawyers thought this was a new kind of search engine. And yeah, okay, so their internet roadkill, they did something bone stupid. But Bing is not quite that far off. The new Bing, I use it a lot. I like it a lot, but anytime it gives you a citation, you have to check whether it exists, because some of the time it doesn't. So yeah, they thought it would do their homework for them. And I mean, one of the questions in terms of using GPTs as labor-saving devices is given the extra levels of checking, is it more work to use it or less work? And I think for a lot of things, it's like, I don't try to write fiction with GPTs that I would publish, because it would be more work to fix it rather than less.
Well, but going back to what I think you and Art were touching upon, though, what it does do is it helps you stimulate ideas and thinking, right?
Yes.
It helps you go down paths you may not necessarily have gone down. It helps you go down those paths or see those paths quicker than you may necessarily would have found otherwise.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really good at telling you what the conventional wisdom on something is.
Got it.
You give it like your paper topic, how you want to write this, and say, write an outline for this, and you can see what's obvious. Whereas you might have an original idea and it may diverge from that, but I think it's very useful. I mean, one of the things I do is if I want to think about something and there's not already a book about it, I will write the title and like a description of the author and a little premise, and tell it to outline the book, and then tell it to write the sections of the book I want as a way of like thinking that thing through. I mean, I don't then generate books and put them on the internet, but it will like go down paths pretty far. So I find it a very useful thing, a process tool rather than end product tool.
Cool. Mr. Bernstein.
Yeah, one thing that GPTs have trouble with is large scale structure. Because they don't have a large scale. They have they're used to one damn word after another, which gets you amazingly far. But it seems to me that the real promise is not in they're writing novels we want to read, but they're reading slush pile. Because the problem of does this look like this might be a bestseller? Seems like something far more amenable to a transformer than please write a bestseller.
Well, I've actually, my research group for a while was using machine learning to look at large novel corpuses. And at one point I like put in the effort to try to understand what the features were. Essentially they start with lots and lots of information, and then they try to narrow it down to fewer and fewer features. And so you'll end up with like 5 features or something. And the features would be things like the length of the words or something like that. Not things that we would distinguish books by. And so like at least half of the features would end up being completely trivial and ridiculous things that would not have any bearing at all on a decision that one would make for the slush pile. So I mean, a lot of people are going to be using these things for stuff they're bad at and making decisions, and they won't know why they're making the decisions, because when these technologies find the features they decide are the salient things that to distinguish things, they may not be things that we would think would be valid at all.
And I'd like to loop Detlef Bayer into this, since he's been thinking more than just about anyone about Tinderbox and ChatGPT.
Yeah,
and
I want to
we actually have that going. What sort of tasks can you see having ChatGPT do within within Tinderbox?
Yeah, I'm just playing around with it, and my main one problem I always had with my personal knowledge management, how to call it, is that I try to get a dynamic way of linking my notes that will add more sense, more meaning to my notes, to my knowledge base. And if I do it manually, like what we saw with the brain, it's a lot of work, and there's nothing that it's not what my brain is doing. It's just manual work, and it's like a notepad, a very, very big notepad. And with ChatGPT, what I'm trying to do is to use my own data and produce links dynamically using ChatGPT. At the moment, I'm just doing a very trivial thing. I'm trying to read out important, that's the tricky stuff, important, significant keywords from the text I entered. And ChatGPT should give me more than give me only the nouns or something like that, but meaningful, important. I don't know how to spell to define important in this way. That's what I'm trying to give in the prompts, and then the rest is I'm doing with normal Tinderbox stuff, like building the links themselves. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the word I use instead of important in that context is the word salient. That tends to get that. I actually use them for keywording also. Another thing to know about particular GPT-4 is that you can enter you can give it things that are spreadsheets and have it manipulate things at the spreadsheet level. I think the key verb for this is tabulate. You tell it to tabulate the answer. And one of the things I will do is give it something and then ask it to make a column that is the keywords. So then you'll get like comparably framed keywords for a bunch of things. What I'm really interested in with Tinderbox and GPT-4 and ChatGPT is possibly as an interface, because I mean, they've got this vast multi-dimensional thing, and they collapse it down to a one-dimensional output, which is just that little line of text that goes along that you watch as it moves. You can somewhat get it beyond that by using the tabulate framework, where you're working in at least 2 dimensions. But it seems to me that there may be something to be done in terms of using Tinderbox or similar as an interface for interacting with it. And I haven't yet experimented with that, but one of the things I did in the last 6 months was to generate sort of design fiction interfaces for what it would look like if you had a better interface for dealing with for engaging with them, if you could get more dimensionality out of this situation. Because each word is a probability. I mean, it's like, okay, that cycling back to where I was talking about pumping things out of GPT-2, there's something called the temperature, which is the relative probability of the next word. And if the temperature, which is I'm somebody that I was watching something about it being the particular usage of this being borrowed from physics. I'm not sure about that, but if the temperature were to be set as at 0, it would only give you the most probable output for each thing. The way they get interesting outputs from these is to allow the temperature to be something other than 0. So it will get a little more creative in the outputs. So the outputs become probabilistic rather than deterministic. But anyway, I'm very interested, and that probabilistic thing you can see as a set of an additional dimension, which is you can see the most probable in some of these outputs. You can see the most probable followed by some others. That's also in the Wolfram thing I was referencing. He has it set up so you can do that.
Well, and I think that raises a really interesting thing to consider. If you consider the fact that most of our human decisions up until I'd say around 2010 have been very deterministically based, if then that modeling. Mm-hmm. And then once we started flipping on the AI switch, which I'm guessing was around 2010 commercially, and then it really picked up in 2016, 2017, and then went crazy about a year and a half ago. we've now moved into a model where so many social, civic, and personal decisions are now being made probabilistically rather than deterministically. And I just think educational wise, social wise, we're not ready for that. We don't know what the implications are when the AI is sitting on the judge's desk saying this person is 84% potentially being a reoffender, put them back in jail. I mean, what does that really mean? As when it comes to all aspects of society. So
and this is where we cycle back into like, what is personality? How is personality represented here? I mean, this is usually expressed in terms of bias, which is, it's as one might think, the AI decisions on what your eligibility for a mortgage have a lot of bias in them. A friend of mine who's in my program just won a hackathon by outlining the mechanisms of this this past week. But I think unless we understand at the person encoding level what that means, and it's not necessarily bias, it may be some completely other animal, it's really hard to have decisions made about people because we don't really know what the information about people we feed into this model are touching on. I mean, there's been a lot of controversy in a couple of bouts about whether or not the GPTs are, quote, biased against Trump. Because somebody will take something where they have try to get the chat GPT to write a nice poem about Joe Biden, and it will do it, and they try to get it to write a nice poem about Donald Trump, and it won't. But Trump is, as a network in this environment, Trump is a completely different animal. I mean, there's this sort of vast network of connected tokens. I mean, Tillerson has a token, Giuliani has a token, Manafort has a token. I mean, why in God's name does Paul Manafort have a token in this thing? Also, it was already observed by somebody else's paper that I actually found yesterday that GPT-2 was memorizing Trump tweets. I found more than 100 memorized Trump tweets. So they're taking this sort of the technologies they have because they're using the Twitter data are distilling the net, if you can just envision it as a Tinderbox network, this vast network of information or misinformation or whatever around Trump, and then there's other people, and so this is an extreme case focused only on like a couple of people. But if you imagine our society as a whole being sucked in to this, it's not that it's handling individual people and judging them by criteria. We may all be positioned in there. I mean, I was looking at the Common Crawl data. The Allen AI Institute has a search engine where you can look for things in the Common Crawl, and they were, my blog is in there. My graduate program's website is in there. I had noticed that ChatGPT could nail my diction when it emulated me, and now I know why. So we're not all equal in the eyes of AI, and there's no equalizing unless we know how it handles personality.
Mr. Chuck. You're on mute, Chuck.
Oops, got it. I just wanted to pick up on that thread a little bit. The whole issue of misinformation has become I think, a valid concern. Not so much because AI is inherently tailored to provide misinformation, but it winds up being a wonderful tool for people who want to create misinformation. And this really does correlate with the way that the internet evolved. And the internet was a great way to distribute information and a great way to distribute misinformation. And now we just have a new tool for generating misinformation. So if we're going to be entering into a world where much of what we encounter is an AI hallucination or a fabricated misinformation that's made to appear valid due to a lot of hard work done by an AI system, what do we do to find the misinformation? And the comment that I've been seeing from multiple sources recently is, boy, this is going to be really hard work. It takes a lot of research to do this. Well, that leads to the question, could AI be the tool for finding misinformation generated by AI? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, in principle, yes, but I think also this comes down to the regulatory framework and I mean, there's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And we all know that when they take vast swaths of the internet, there's a lot of garbage in. And so part of the question, just plain in terms of outputs that OpenAI has clearly been grappling with is, you know, how to fix that. And if they don't fix it at the bottom level, then it gets harder to fix later. But then, you know, government gets involved, is beginning to get involved. And I would point you at Jim Jordan's committee, where he's taking out after, I believe, after people who have like been interested in combating misinformation on the internet. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, AI may be our great friend who can combat or information. On the other hand, using AI to combat misinformation, you know, under certain kinds of government environments might be illegal 10 years from now. So it's kind of hard to see how this is going to play out. It clearly needs to be regulated by whom and by what technologies, and then can all of the regulatory frameworks that were put in place to combat misinformation then be flipped on their heads when some governmental agency and entity in the future wants there to be misinformation.
Awesome, Mr. Eddie.
Is it assumed that keywords have a single meaning? I wrestle with the so as far as I know, I mean, thank you very much for reaffirming that ChatGPT is just word counting, next word, which hasn't changed in 70 years.
Well, I mean, and part of the tokenization schemas presuppose that their nodes will have multiple meanings, because they're starting at the letter level. And the way the byte pair encoding works is, it's like if it's probabilistically desirable to have an I next to a T, you also make an IT so that you get the word it, and then you just keep building bigger and bigger and bigger ones until, if you run this process long enough on a thing with long enough words in it, you'll get tokens like interdisciplinarity or something like that.
Now, can we pause? We can pause you real quick there. I think partly what David's referring to though is, so you've got a word called interdisciplinary, but that word may have multiple meanings for people.
Yes.
Right? So who is going to determine the word, the meaning of that word in its context?
Well, I mean, that's part of the black magic of this is the system is supposed to be able to sort this out, but you're already starting at the most basic particles at things with multiple meanings, and working upwards towards ones with specific meanings, where Tillerson sort of is much more specific than you know, CAR or something like that. CAR can be car, but it can also be part of another word. So the baseline is that they have multiple meanings. It's not adding ambiguity to some certainty. It works the other direction. When it builds more and more complex tokens, it's adding certainty to a situation where everything has multiple meanings. And it's done, you know, through the black box technology.
Don't trust black boxes. Kathryn, I would, given your somewhat unique background, is the word, well, keyword on the theme of keyword, is the word Venona, VENONA, known to you?
No.
Okay, write it down, look it up.
Okay.
A long time ago, I was at a machine learning conference, and late at night, we were discussing the prospects for building language models. And Oliver Selfridge, who did the work that primordially in the 60s, it primordially underlies this, the statistical models behind the perceptron, the tiniest little atom of neural nets, was saying that given a complicated enough network, you could probably actually generate language or anything else you wanted. And my counter argument was that this is great for getting things done, but we still don't understand what they're doing. We wouldn't understand what they were doing. And people have been very good at making black boxes that can do tasks and learn. They're called other people. And we trust that mechanism. We call that mechanism the future. So it's unfair to throw too many bricks at ChatGPT for being inscrutable. People are inscrutable.
Well, also there's another way in which there's a black box problem beyond the mere fact that it's sort of the magic of the algorithm will make sense of it all and that's how they work, which is that there is the word sophisticated and the usage of this is like how wine can be sophisticated by the addition of things other than grapes and water. There are apparently like 64 different things you can add that are legal to add to wine to make it, the end product. And when you go to Trader Joe's and get a really cheap, good wine, it probably has a lot of those things in it. So I think a lot of the sophistications that were present in GPT-4 are beginning to come out of the shadows in the form of plugins and helper apps and so on. One of the things I like to feed to these things is the question, how far is Westport, New York from Lake Champlain? And I used to work at Wolfram Research, and I was part of the, sort of peripherally involved in the launch of Wolfram Alpha. And there was one point at which I was tasked with persuading somebody to sell us the perimeters of bodies of water. And it's partly my fault that it did not happen. So I was waiting for them to solve this. But so right now, or actually not today, but the answer for years has been 25 miles, because that's the distance between where I am, about 300 yards from the lake, and the center of the lake. Westport, New York is a lovely shoreline town on the shoreline of Lake Champlain that can see Vermont, and I can see the lake from here. And if you feed it to different systems, you can get a sense of what's going on behind there, because this is not something that's easily arrivable at by language. And so when ChatGPT gave me the answer that the distance from here to Lake Champlain is 25 miles, I knew it was not getting that from language. It was some kind of detour into some other kind of system. There are another indication of detours into some other kind of system is when ChatGPT came out, it would do a whole bunch of different kinds of poetry. And it was the middle of the winter, and I had just come in from, taking a chicken that had not gone in out of the snow and sticking it in a chicken coop, having trudged through to get the chicken from a place it should not be. So I fed it, I asked it to write, a sonnet, a sestina, a haiku, a press release, a short story, a bunch of different things about those three things: a woman, a chicken, and a snowstorm. And nearly all of them had essentially the same plot. And that is not probabilistic. So there was some kind of detour into what is this, into finding narrative consistency or something that was needed to make their poetry feature run. So there's a bunch of sophistication of this. So that's basically fancy autocomplete, but oh yeah, they put a bunch of other stuff, and no, they're not going to tell you what's in there, and they're not going to tell you how it works.
Interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, there was a beautiful example last summer with Dolly. This is right before they went from having like 6 images to having 4. And I was trying to, at that point, they would not allow you to depict like politicians. And so I was trying to figure out, you could get like a picture of Twiggy, but you couldn't get a picture of any, Charles Schumer or something. And so I tried a politician adjacent category, which was the British royal family. And I asked for a picture of a portrait of Prince Charles by Andy Warhol. And so it gave me a set of 6 Andy Warhol-esque people, and half of them were female, and one of them was Black, and one of them looked Jewish, and so on. So it was like that. I think they had taken some they had some little subroutine that was supposed to give you, diversity when you asked for a picture of a doctor, and applied this to Prince Charles, which was, and it was like that for about a week, and then it went away. But I mean, they have all these ridiculous little add-on, Rube Goldberg add-ons to try to make the thing behave that they don't tell you about.
Interesting. So 2 conversations, if you don't mind. One is, and Art raises an important point, is the conversation we're having right now American Canadian centric? So and I don't know how it couldn't be. So like, how do we start bringing in more Eastern thinking into the AI models, and maybe African thinking into the AI models? Is there other cultural thinking that we're not contributing to the conversation we're having right now? And then the second question I have is, how are mere mortals, those people just trying to wake up in the morning, take care of their kids, live their lives, going to survive in all of this? So maybe you can answer those 2, respond to those 2 comments.
The first question is, a lot of people need to build a lot of models, and that maybe the giant foundation models that, the one ring to rule them all kind of models should go away. But the other possibility is, and this is what OpenAI and similar are trying now, is to just grab all the languages and all the culture in the world and stuff it in there. And, that works about as well as you think it does.
Yeah, you create mud, right?
Yeah. In terms of how mere mortals survive, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm running as fast as I can to, in the matter of the Red Queen, to stay in one place to try to figure out what's going on. This is all happening on a tremendously compressed time frame. It's like one thing comes out fast. I mean, I actually have sort of paused trying to keep up with exactly what they're doing to try to get to the bottom of the matter of personal names being in tokenizers. And I thought I could knock out a paper about this in about a week, and that was 5 weeks ago. And so one of these weeks I will knock it out in about a week. But
And your issue there is because of the privacy nature of it, and the fact that, how can personal names like a Donald Trump be influencing the models in such a way that they are? Is that the issue, or really?
Well, I mean, okay, there's a first of all, there's the ghost of Donald Trump haunting OpenAI's things in a couple of different ways. I mean, if you were setting out to write a hypertext novel and you started with a bunch of nodes that looked like this, it would be a novel about Donald Trump. That having been said, it's a really hard question to know how to talk about the causality of what those tokens do in this magic black box process. I mean, one of the reasons it's like, okay, I can look at it from the point of view of what I would do if I was setting out and as an intelligent entity making connections between this set of 100,000 tokens, and only about 250 of them are names. What happens with those names? So I can think of how it would look like if I did that. And then also from the standpoint of narrative coherence, one of the things that the technologists seem not to have considered is that narrative coherence involves both literary point of view, and it also involves characters. The history of human knowledge has involved characters for the most part, most of the time. It's very hard to find examples of things that actually don't involve one kind or another of persona or character in there somewhere. It's embedded in the names of the mathematics, among other things. So you can't really get away from character in terms of human knowledge, but the people who designed these systems seem to think that you could. But I don't, but it's hard, I can figure out, I think I've now figured out how this sort of raft of cultural driftwood ends up on the shore, but what it does when it's there is hard to know.
Okay. Anybody else? So let's bring it back to the tool and your experience with Tinderbox.
Yeah.
So I like your idea of, and let's combine some of what what Detlef's been doing with lately in, feeding paragraphs into Tinderbox and coming back with keywords. And we'll combine that with some of the work I'm doing is then having Tinderbox automatically create notes for me and automate the note creation and linking creation. So that will help me build my hyperbolic maps. And be able to then start understanding association between things. So like when I'm doing my writing, I've created some action code that I can say, okay, rather than having Tinderbox tell me the keywords, I give it the keywords, and then it creates those keyword notes for me and then links those keyword notes or those people notes or those entity notes to this node that is the note that I'm working on. So then I can start getting this really interesting hyperbolic map of, this article or this story is related to these people, is related to those entities. And so
I mean, okay, so imagine that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Imagine that you have, your notes and, what you think is going on here. And then you asked it to make an additional node that sat between each of them and name the connections.
Yes.
Which is to say somehow framing the one thing in terms of the other. It's actually really good at framing. I got it to, for example, in the poetry mode, rewrite the Robert Frost poem "Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening" in terms of graph theory, and it actually did a pretty good poem doing exactly that. So you can get things seen in terms of other things, but you can essentially have it build additional richness connection between the things you've already got there.
And in terms of the context of Tinderbox, so there's this us manually doing it versus the tool helping us automate those things. So when I have Tinderbox automatically create a note for me, I have it also label that link. And so, depending on the context of the situation I am, a person might be a contact, a person, an employee, so that one person then could end up having multiple link types, even to the same node,
right,
depending on the relationship of that context.
Right.
Right. And again, we can do that manually within Tinderbox, but tying it together with this with the GPT models, could that help us? Could that help guide us? Could that some of that form be those
think,
link types and those word creations be automated?
I think if I was sitting down to do that, I would look at, first of all, the way in which one can do neat tricks with spreadsheet type objects, and figure if there are analogous ways to do that with a Tinderbox like structure. That you can, for example, tell it to add more. You can say add columns. Reframe, this concept in terms of how George Lakoff would talk about it, in the terminology of category theory or something like that. You can tell it to add, you can have your idea and you can tell it to do that, or you can have it make more similar lines. So you could have a bunch of things that were linked in a way and say, add more nodes to this structure if one could ask it correctly, and it conceivably could do that. Again, you would want those labeled as GPT generated ones, but I think the kinds of ways to manipulate it in terms of spreadsheet like things could be deployed there. But also just plain trying to get it to answer in ways where it's filling out more things to give it a more multidimensional possibility of answering might work. I mean, it's really absurd that they're giving, we get one dimensional, or then if we use a tabulate kind of framework too. But I think it's possible that one would be able to elicit more elaborate things from it. I mean, part of it is that the prompting as a language for getting a computer to do something is not very robust. Partly because some of the ways it answers prompts is probabilistic, but also because OpenAI is tinkering behind the scenes, and you may have come up with the perfect prompt to do something behind the scenes this week, and they might change it next week. So it's good to have some kind of scripting language like Python or something, or Mathematica, to build reliable structures where you minimize what parts can move around on you.
All right, so Chuck, before we jump in, that leads to two questions. One, Art has in the chat. So who can add these nodes is his question to the structure. Can anyone add those nodes? And that leads me to the next question, Bill, in reaction to what you just said. If ChatGPT continues to, and I'm assuming OpenAI, or I don't know, whoever the who is, can be behind the scenes manipulating the process. At what point does that give them like autocratic dictatorial control to influence us?
Well, they have it now.
I know. And should they be regulated? Should they be controlled? I mean, that's pretty scary.
Well,
so let's go back to Art's question first though. Who gets to add nodes?
Well, I mean, the thing is, what I'm thinking in terms of like Tinderbox, I think it's like you would give permission to your cozy little GPT thing that you're talking to add nodes. Now, if you're doing something on a larger scale,
I'm sorry, and in the context of a Tinderbox, a node would be a note.
Yes.
Yeah, and then all the attributes wrapped around it. That's a
Yes.
node. Got it. Okay, keep going.
So the way I'm visualizing this in terms of Tinderbox and story space world is that you could potentially allow GPTs to add the kinds of things that already exist in Tinderbox, which is to say the notes and the connections between notes and those attributes, and so on.
Okay. All right.
Oh, also images. It can,
Right. And again, look, we can come back to my question in a minute, though. How do we make sure that these people behind the scenes, this cabal, if you will, is not manipulating society for their own purposes? But I don't want to go into conspiracy theory yet. Robert, you've been patiently trying to jump in, and then Chuck, you get to go next.
Oh, and I should be patient because this question is not exactly in the flow of what we're talking about. But I see that we're starting to get a little bit toward our last lap, so I wanted to put it on the table.
It's all good. Jump in.
And one thing I think about is if you look in history, whenever there's been a marginalized group, they develop sort of their own slang or language or inside jokes to communicate around or out of sight of the mainstream of discourse. And then I also see that with a lot of technological or cultural changes, people who don't like those things will try to make communities, areas, scenarios where they can separate themselves from those things. And so I'm wondering if we start to see everything becomes suffused with AI, and it becomes difficult to know whether what we're seeing or seeing or hearing is generated from AI, that we might try to see the attempts to create a level of jokes or slang or communities that would, you know, retain human purity. That's how a person might think, and try to you know, escape this. So I just wanted to put that out there and see what you thought.
Well, I mean, I think that's already happening now with a lot of the visual arts community. And I think that there will be a greater emphasis on the kinds of techniques that AI can't do to make it clearer, you know, that this is created by a person. But in terms of the general, you know, I don't think that foundation models, which is to say these things that are supposed to run through the top, like they're supposed to be the new fire, the new water, the new electricity, are a good idea, because it's like there's just too many different ways in which you have to smooth out the edges and make a lot of people's point of view go away to make the AI infusion, as it was called about a year or so ago. Actually, that's more of a kind of 2 years ago term, but to work. I mean, but also the EU is kind of on task. The AI infusion, as envisioned by Adobe and others, that it would just infuse all of the products and somehow make them work better invisibly, seems to have been stepped on a lot by the EU in terms of their regulation.
All right, Mr. Chuck.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on the thread that you brought up earlier, Kathryn, about the calculator and the potential for AI to be a useful tool to people to amplify thinking and explore different dimensions. One of the areas where I see a great deal of interest in applying AI, and this correlates with some of my interests and could be one of the ways that Tinderbox can come into providing a useful role, is correlation. We are swamped with tremendous amount of information. I don't mean information in the media sense, but stuff that comes from an electric grid, stuff that comes from a sewer system, stuff that comes, I mean the monitoring of sewer systems, stuff that looks at weather, stuff that looks at the impact of weather on climate, stuff that looks at the impact of climate and weather on performance of a network. I mean, there are such connections. The correlation is a challenge in a sense, because we have so much more information to correlate.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give a specific example of where there's a tremendous amount of interest in this, and it's the whole area of cybersecurity. We have vast streams of information coming in to anybody who's monitoring a big data center or a big network that relate to potential attacks or potential anomalies. And the problem is false positives. And so there's a huge labor content associated with utilizing tools that currently monitor this kind of information, because for any useful stuff to come out, you've got to correlate it with enough information to make a determination that you can actually say that is a problem, that is not a problem. And so I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of making a productive use of AI in the whole field of finding correlations. And where I think this might relate to is your background with Wolfram and Mathematica and some of the other tools, which have long been tools for dealing with correlation.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the places where it will be helpful is its ability to write code, which is, so far we've mostly been talking about its ability to generate language. But as a programmer, I'm terrible. I am never going to grow up to be a good programmer, but my ability to do things with code has radically improved since I had access, since I've had access to ChatGPT and GPT-4. And okay, cybersecurity wise, okay, so here, somebody's got a thing, and now that was successfully being a piece of malware, and now a thing has been put in place to stop it. You can sit there, and if you ask it right, you might be able to get the AI to tell you how to get around the the filtering or the blocking of your malware. But I think one of the places where you can see the extent to which it's a problem to solve things the way you're talking about is that, as a large language model, I cannot do the completely innocuous thing you asked me to do. I mean, OpenAI is scrambling as fast as they can to try to prevent all manner of things from happening with their software, and it's clunky as hell, and pretty obnoxious. And yeah, okay, maybe later they'll get better at it, so it's not refusing to tell you the spherical cow joke because that might be political or something. But I think the potential for making it easier to write malware is probably advancing faster than the potential for stopping malware with it.
Sadly true.
Okay, that was a pause. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like us to bring us back to the very beginning. So we talked about this idea of your particular area of research right now is this understanding and let me see if I can find your actual words. Basically understanding the personality. I've got notes all over the place, and maybe you can reword it for me while I'm looking for it.
I think personality in the age of digital reproduction is maybe.
That was it.
Yes.
And what do you mean by digital reproduction? And
well, I mean, okay, your Mark's Wikipedia entry is a reproduction of a digital reproduction of his personality, and there are clearly some kind of digital reproductions of my personality beyond my Wikipedia entry, stashed away in GPT-4 because it looks like my blog is part of the training data. So once you're in the training data and it's configured something that in one way or another represents its representation of you, and it may not just be one, you may be all over the place if you did a bunch of disparate things. That's the digital reproduction of personality.
Well, I think a better example is there are several short stories, I believe, in which Kathryn Cramer at some age or another appears as a character under another name. And those are, in a sense, recognizable because they are like Kathryn Cramer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and we can say, oh, yes, that must be Kathryn Cramer in that story, even though we're not told it.
And also in terms of how such things would be recognized in a language model, it might be a two-headed Kathryn Cramer. There would be Kathryn Cramer and there would be Kathryn Cramer Brownell, and who writes about Hollywood and politics. And it may not necessarily get the idea that we're separate people,
So take a step back then too, is maybe in our last 8 minutes, we'll go back to an area that I'm particularly interested in is, to what extent do I as a human being have agency over control over these digital reproductions, right? At what sense do I get to this is who I am, and I get to assert this is me, this is my digital or physical penumbra to which I want to manage and control. And like right now, we're so over, the average individual has thousands of commercial labels that have been applied to them by companies that want to sell them shit. Mm-hmm. Right. And manipulate how they're sold to and how they're spoken to. So how do we manage that membrane of me as an individual to the membrane to which society is trying to design for me?
Well, last October, I got flown out to Austin to a meeting of the Association of Privacy Professionals. Mm-hmm. And I knew almost no one there. There was one person there I had met before, but I was there for 3 days. So I spent most of those 3 days walking around the vendor area, asking questions and finding out about technologies. There are all kinds of arcane rules about what can and cannot be stored in your database, and there are companies that have the job of making it happen, no matter how naive or foolish the people who wrote these regulations are. And so there are vast technologies that are out there for monitoring it. I mean, this is part of what fed my curiosity and, okay, how can you find this? And I walked around the floor and I described large language models and then also the art models to several of the vendors who said that they had like technologies that can like look in and find your pieces of personal information. And they assured me they could find it in large language models. And I tried to follow up with them and no one would answer my email asking for access as a student at the University of Vermont. People are, oh yeah, totally, get in touch with us. Here's my, they did not want to go anywhere near discussing that. But now I have a better idea of where such things might be found. But there is a whole technological infrastructure that is already set up to look for this. The question is now, can they go in and look at it? Look at language models.
But I go back to the mere mortal question though earlier. You know, there is, I think we've reached a confluence in around 2020 where you have the organizational and people-centric approaches to personal data and our identities.
Mm-hmm.
Right now you have, and we're very much going down this hard left through due to entropy, where Big Brother was an optimist, you know, Orwell was an optimist, where we as individual mere mortals have no control over ourselves and the
Well, I
influence of
mean,
these
all you
models
need
on
to
us.
do is build a time machine and go back to the beginning of the internet and put little no robots script on everything that you put on the internet, so that any page you put up cannot be indexed into AI in the future.
No, but I think you missed my point though. That's not just about the content to which I create and contribute.
Oh yeah.
It's by the fact that these systems and these machines are interpreting and labeling me without my permission, without my control.
Yeah.
They're going into, you know, Experian just got caught not so long ago going into private chats about different psychological disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And pulling that out, and what was presumably private chats are now part of the model that labels me as, you know, could be labeling me as someone that needs to be taking these types of medications.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, that's not me producing content. That's the system producing content on me.
Yes, that's true too.
You know, and
But
that's
I mean,
really,
but that's not how, for example, GPT-3 could nail my narrative voice. That was me. That's on me. That's because I thought I wanted all of my stuff to be, you know, to show up on Google, and preventing, you know, the robots from accessing my website would have made it so that I would have a lower Google ranking. So a lot of things that various of us did to be more findable are now made it so that we are now part of the, you know, part of the group mind, whether we want to be or not. And it's not just like, did I buy, you know, a drill last week, or am I ordering life extension vitamins? There is a certain amount of it that we did to ourselves by wanting to be, you know, up there on Google.
yeah, but that baby that's born today, I mean, that's part of the issue. Our digital footprint is established about what, at that first doctor's appointment, 6-10 weeks after conception.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, that individual had no control of that happening. So I just think there's a much broader conversation we need to be having when it comes to all of the sovereignty and agency of self.
I think though that there's also what the law as written now thinks of as private information, you know, personally identifiable private information, and and the much larger set of data, that the information that those companies in that great vast room were trying to crack down on, is a very, you know, is your credit card numbers, your address, your social security number kind of things. Whereas, you know, Dave McKean's artistic style being appropriated is, I think, in some ways much more intrusive than the kinds of things that they're able to regulate. And
Yeah,
and
well,
some-
but think about today though, like the average connected car is producing 5 terabytes of data a day, or
Yeah.
something to that extent. That's my IoT. That's my device. I control that. I viewed it. I managed it. But yet the automotive companies are stealing that today.
Yep.
Industry
Yeah.
is stealing that today. How do we
Yeah.
manage that? I mean, that is also contributing to this broader thing.
Yes.
Interesting. All right. Well, we're right at about our 10:30 hour, and I'm sure we could continue this on all day long. Do we have any parting remarks from anybody? I don't want to be the last voice. Who wants to chime in with one?
Actually, I have a parting remark after
Please.
everybody else is done. Well, I mean, so what preceded the book? I mean, in terms of like intellectual culture informing ideas and so on, there was an elaborate technology of memory. And one of the relevances to this current technology is the same kind of like tokenization schemas that we now see in terms of building large language models also went into the creation of the classical art of memory. I outlined earlier a scenario in which the best-selling novel situation can cause essentially the fiction apocalypse. What comes after the book as we know it? I think what the language models are is kind of memory palaces so large we can't see the edges. And one of the kinds of things that I'm envisioning myself working on in the future is, creating artisanal language models that are like what might replace the book. And I find that really exciting. I haven't figured out how to do it yet, but this sort of goes back to what I learned, sitting in Mark's basement working on hypertext. That there is a thing to come after the kind of the culture of knowledge we have now, and I'm really interested in that.
And I think there was one other question though, is what happens when, and going back to the chat and then we'll wrap up. What happens when the AI is teaching itself based on what it's produced and not what humans produce?
It gets stupider. It's like over sharpening your image and the sharpen edges thing in Photoshop. Essentially it gets very contrasty. It develops a lower vocabulary and more extreme views of,
Got it. So we do need to we somehow need to find a way to keep the human in this process.
Mm-hmm.
But that, going back to Robert's point though, I think that's could become a challenge.
Yeah.
All right. So everyone, are we, what do you think? Is it a wrap? Are we good? Any final comments, questions? Well, fabulous. Thank you very, very much. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Well, thank you. This was fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.